Jeff had been a police officer for the small town of Briar for 6 years. The town had a population of about 7,000, and positioned as they were in the North Georgia hills, he didn't get a lot of tourist traffic like some of the towns in the area. Blair got its fair share of leaf lookers, people in vans or SUVs who came up to see the leaves and clog up traffic for a few months, but they were usually gone by mid-November, or early December at the latest. They blew away with the leaves, and Blair was left as sleepy and quiet as usual. The town had a Walmart, as all towns do, 6 restaurants, 2 chains and 4 local spots, a hardware store, 2 gas stations, 2 red lights, and a small Main Street area sporting a dozen little shops. They had a combination K through 12, and the Blair Thorns hadn't gone past the local division since Clay Jackson took them to state in the late 90s. It was a small town that rarely needed the 4 deputies who assisted Sheriff Whitaker in the day-to-day protection of the town. So, when Jeff got a call about a disturbance out at 56 West Tree, he had no reason to expect anything but local kids, or maybe town drunks. The state had been getting calls all night about the usual drunken revelers, but most of it had been about the strange occurrences at the abandoned farmhouse. At 2046, a neighbor called in a noise complaint from the plot of land that had once been a fruitful field. They claimed to have heard a loud crash from the abandoned farmhouse, and asked if someone would drive by and check on the property. Jeff was on patrol when dispatch had called it in, and he turned his cruiser into the Sip and Slurp parking lot and made his way out of town. The snow was falling again, and the roads were icy, but Jeff had lived here all his life. It was nothing new to him. He knew these roads like the back of his hand. 56 West Tree had been abandoned for almost 5 years. The home was a piece of local legend, and the city council had been debating having it torn down as it slipped further and further into despair. Jeff had gone there many times as a kid. Most kids did, and he saw the old house silhouetted as it sat on top of the hill. He could see the familiar farmhouse with its sagging roof and brittle walls, but there was a new element to the house that Jeff had never seen. The car sticking out of the side of the house was definitely a new addition. He pulled his cruiser into the front yard, lights training on the car, and he drew his weapon as he stalked towards the smoking vehicle. It was a new vehicle, something sporty and sleek before the collision. Someone had driven their car into the side of the house and made a large hole in the wall. Jeff jumped as his foot came down on something and discovered further vandalism. Someone had also shattered the windows of the old house, an action that seemed petty considering the hole in the wall. The driver was nowhere to be found, and after radioing in the incident to the station, Jeff started searching the scene. He looked through the hole, checking the small room for signs of the driver. The decrepit relic of a house was as silent as the grave, but Jeff was still hesitant to go inside. How often had he and his friends dared each other to go in as they stood at the perimeter fence? 56 West Tree was supposedly the most haunted house in town, and the local preacher had claimed many times that the devil's voice could be heard inside. It was originally owned by the Jafforth clan, a family who could trace their roots back to the town's founding. At least, they could have if there had been any Jafforths left. Town legend was that 30 years ago, William Jafforth had walked into the sheriff's department on a dark and stormy night and laid a bloody axe on the sheriff's desk. He admitted to murdering his wife and children, and when the sheriff went out to the house with his constables, the whole clan had been found dead in their beds. They had each been killed with a single axe blow, and not a soul had woken up during the attack. When asked why he had done it, William said that he wouldn't let another Jafforth die for this town, and would instead drag his family tree up by the roots. He died in prison a few years later, and every family that attempted to live thereafter had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Jeff's radio keyed up as he stood thinking about the old house's reputation, and scared him near to death. "We'll send a wrecker out there in the morning, Car 3. Get back to your beat and just leave it alone." "Understood," Jeff said, stepping gratefully away from the hole in the wall. As he climbed into his car, Jeff was a little relieved. The place still gave him the heebie-jeebies, and if he didn't have to go into the old farmhouse, all the better. Jeff was just starting his cruiser when a loud groan drew his attention back to the house. The roof was sagging under the weight of all that falling powder, and as he shone the searchlight on his cruiser at the house, He could swear he saw something walk past the upstairs window. Jeff killed the engine and stepped out of his car, his eyes still glued to that window. He squinted as the spotlight covered the window, but the dusty glass was too caked to see much. Jeff reached for the door handle, but let it go again as he turned back towards the house. Jeff had never mustered up the courage to go in as a kid, but if the perp was still inside, maybe even injured or incoherent, he would have to brave the confines of the Jafforth homestead. He stepped in through the hole and into the dusty living room beyond. It was still furnished, and Jeff saw a sagging green couch, 2 armchairs, and a cold TV, all covered in a thick layer of dust. Pictures hung lopsidedly on the walls, and a ballet of dust motes danced and swirled in the beams of Jeff's flashlight. He could see a line of footprints heading towards the stairs, and Jeff drew his gun as he followed them into the velvety darkness. The fact that they were bare with so much snow on the ground lifted the hairs on the back of his neck, and Jeff could see the barrel of his gun jittering as he mounted those steps. The upstairs hallway was long and unfurnished, but he could see that only one of the doors was ajar, and made a beeline for it. Sweeping his gun about, checking his blind spots, Jeff pushed the door and listened to it creak open horror movie fashion. The bedroom was a wreck. It had been small, holding only a single bed and nightstand, but both were shoved over, laying sprawled across what was left of the floor. Someone had torn up the floorboards, and a crowbar lay like a discarded snakeskin nearby. The hole yawned like some skeletal mouth, and whatever had been inside was now long gone. Jeff swung his light around, looking for whoever had moved past the window, and when his foot sank into the floor, he realized that he'd been careless. The edge of the hole had crumbled when he'd come down on it, and Jeff gasped as he sank up to the ankle. His light swiveled fretfully, searching for ambushers, and when he pulled his foot free, he saw that something was stuck to it. Jeff reached down and found the pages of a book stuck to the bottom of his boot. He moved his light down and saw that his foot had come down on the book beneath the floorboards. The book was ragged, the cover moldy and bloated, and the pages on his foot weren't the only ones that had come loose. There were a few pages inside the hole, and as Jeff looked, they appeared to be someone's journal. The ink was old and a little flaky, and it appeared that his boot had ruined the middle part of the journal. As he looked down into the hole, Jeff felt moved to take them, something he had never done in all his time on the force. He couldn't say if it was his subconscious or the voice of the devil, but he scooped it up and slid the ragged thing into his pocket, snatching the other pages too for good measure. When the radio crackled, Jeff jumped like he'd been caught doing something naughty. "Car 3, are you still at the vehicle?" The usual sleepy dispatcher sounded almost frantic, and it made Jeff edgy. He checked in, and dispatch told him to stay with the vehicle and under no circumstances to leave it. The vehicle he had found, lodged in the side of the house, was involved in a kidnapping case the next town over, and they were very interested in finding out where the perp had gone. Backup was on the way, and Jeff needed to sit tight and wait for further instructions. Jeff said that he copied, and headed down so that he could sit by the car until help arrived. He came back through the hole to find the car still lodged in the breach. Jeff took a seat on the cold metal bumper of the vehicle, listening to it click and groan, but as the wind howled and the snow fell, he decided he might be more comfortable in his squad car. As the snow came down, obscuring the windshield, Jeff pulled the moldy book out of his pocket and thumbed through it. The dates inside went back about 120 years and occurred during the founding of the town. The owner talked about leaving their home and traveling to this little piece of nothing. After the move, it was mostly entries about farming or building, but one particular entry caught his eye. December 12th. I had a meeting tonight with the town elders. Honeycutt and Treen want to forego this year's sacrifice. They don't want to build an altar and claim we have other, more pressing things to worry about. More pressing matters. Did we not leave our homes and forego our lots in life so that we could worship as we saw fit? Did we not run into the hills so we could start over? I spoke with the others after they left, and Norwell and Rita want to make an example of them. Perhaps this year we've already found our sacrifice. Norwell. Jeff knew that name. Norwells were big landowners in the area, and readers owned the library and the land the municipal building sat on. He flipped over to the next day and read about the construction of an altar out in a clearing near a large pool of water. Unless there were many places like that around here, that had to be Harder's Den, a place Jeff had swam as a kid. They had quarried stone there and used it to assemble the altar. This didn't seem weird to any of those involved, and over the next few days of entries, they detailed the preparations for a sacrifice. Jeff had never read anything in the town histories about sacrifices before, and the idea that they'd been held in a place he'd gone to as a kid was a little frightening. The rest of that month was full of talk about winter storms and heated arguments between the elders, culminating in a chilly entry on December 24th. December 24th. Treen came to me last night and offered documents that implicate Honeycutt in sabotage. He attempted to undermine the altar, would see it unworthy of the Green Man when he comes. As such, his family now stands as sacrifice. My son William doesn't understand. He and Masha Honeycutt were very close, but he'll understand the reason in time. When something pollutes your crop, you draw it up by the root so it doesn't poison the field. I can hear their screams as I write this. He has found them. Jeff was shaken out of his reading as the blue and whites approached. 2 town cop cars were sailing up the driveway, followed by 6 state troopers in a black town car that might have been FBI. Jeff stepped out of the cruiser, laying the book on the seat. The town car had 4 other town cops, the sheriff included. He pulled himself out of the cruiser, the wheels groaning a little as his weight left the seat, and he walked over to Jeff. He pumped his arm in a single motion, asking for a report on the situation. Jeff told him about the car, showed him how it had been wedged in the side of the house, and explained that the driver, or whoever they were, had been nowhere to be found. As they spoke, Jeff couldn't help but notice the man in the black suit as he stepped gracefully out of the sedan. As they trundled into the snow, breath steaming in the cold, the man organized them into groups and told them to get moving. He wanted the house searched from top to bottom, asshole to appetite, but when Jeff went to help, he called him to the porch instead. He wanted to know what Jeff had seen, and Jeff hesitated as he thought about the book. Suddenly, Jeff felt an urge to hide its existence, but shook it off at once. He was an officer of the law, and if the book could help their investigation, he needed to tell him. He grimaced as he handed him the moldy old thing, but skimmed it over as the cover left stains on his leather gloves. The man's face grew severe. "Have you read this?" "Some. First 10 pages or so. Sounds like a journal, sir. I figure it's Jafforth's, the family who used to live here when the town was first founded." "Does it say anything in here about sacrifice? Maybe even a green man?" Yeah, it does. How did you... Been following this case a while, kid. Where does it say their altar is?" "It sounds like it's down at Harder's Den. It makes sense. Harder's is only a mile or so into the woods that way. If they had a spot out there, it would be easy to get there from here, and they could..." The man nodded as he called inside. The stomping of boots preceded them, and as they arrayed on the porch, the sheriff was red in the face from exertion. He asked if the blustery old man knew the spot the book talked about, and the sheriff nodded as he pointed up the road. He set the book down with a thump, looking up the road where the sheriff had pointed, and Jeff could see the excitement, plain as day, on his face. "Excellent. Let's go. We can still catch them if we hurry." He turned to the assembled men, looking at each as he spelled out what they were going into the woods to do. "Listen up, because I want total silence once we're in the woods. This man has a kid with him, and he's getting ready to sacrifice him to some make-believe bugaboo. He's nuts, but he's not stupid. Keep your eyes open, and be ready to mow him down if necessary. I'd hate to lose the kid, but this guy's killed 10 people in the last 5 years. I'll be damned if I let him escape. Sheriff Critch, you stay here with the vehicle and let the officer come with us," he said, pointing at Jeff as they prepared to go. Sheriff Critch was monstrously fat and pushing 60, but he seemed to bristle at the idea of being left behind. He didn't like wandering through the woods under the best of circumstances, but he certainly didn't want to be left behind, so some wet-behind-the-ears rookie could take all the credit. He glowered at Jeff, and the younger officer didn't need to ask. He'd worked with Sheriff Critch long enough to know that he would not stay here while the most significant case of his career happened around him. His next words saved Jeff's life, though he doubted the sheriff knew it. "I've come this far, Agent Reinfield. Let me finish this up with you." Reinfield grinned at him, and Jeff suddenly hoped that he would ask him to stay behind. That grin looked ghastly. "Very well, then. Lead the way to Harder's Den. You, stay here with the vehicles," he said, and he pointed at Jeff. "We'll radio if we run into trouble. Here, keep this safe until I get back." He pressed the journal against Jeff's chest, and the shaking officer had little choice but to take it, as the men ran back to their cars. With that, the expedition set out towards the woods, and Jeff watched from the porch as they disappeared into the trees. As he stood on the porch, the wind blew against him, cutting right through his thick police-issue jacket. Jeff decided to climb back in his cruiser, the car cranking after a few tries as the heater drove away the chill. He opened the journal to the page he'd left off and thumbed through the entries after the first sacrifice. It was mostly town meetings, growing records, and stockline reports, but amongst them were prayers to the Green Man for a beautiful harvest, or graven images scratched into the page so they might never be erased. The town began to grow up around the collection of farms, and some of the founders moved their families into town to set up shops and establish a community. The Jafforths continued to live in the farmhouse on the outskirts of town, and a year after their first sacrifice, there was another. December 24th. Treen seemed shocked when the mark appeared on his door. A lot of people seemed shocked, but they needn't have. Treen was a traitor and a naysayer. He invited that minister into our community, invited him to establish a church here, and just expected the rest of us to go along with it. Nay, the man must go. We'll drag him and his whelps from their beds if we must. We will pull them up from the root and stem and have an end to Treen and his ilk. The fires are stoked, and the altar is built. Tonight, he comes for his sacrifice. Who was him, Jeff wondered. Who was this Green Man the book mentioned earlier? The Green Man they spoke of was a mystery to him. Jeff had lived in the town his whole life and had never heard of this Green Man. If he was a throwback to times gone by, then why was there no mention of the Green Man in town history? Maybe this was one of those things they wanted swept under the rug, Jeff thought, and read on. The radio crackled, dispatch looking for updates, and Jeff checked in, telling dispatch he was still at the farmhouse. Someone from the woods checked in as well, letting dispatch know they were still in pursuit and making their way through the woods. As dispatch copied, Jeff returned to the journal, finding that the start of the third year was a little more turbulent. February 4th. The town prospers, I suppose, but our way of life is in jeopardy from those outsiders. When we came here, 10 families looking for a place to worship and be free, it was so we might draw strength from our shared faith. Now this minister, Reverend Lundgren, has established a church and drawn a flock. The farmers and settlers from the nearby area have come into the town and fallen under his spell. As his influence grows, he believes he can hold some power here. Curse Treen, curse the man to the soil. He invited the man here, and now he's burrowed in like a mole. Even some of our own have fallen to his poison religion. More the fool they. There is but one God, and he is green and terrible. Mayhaps we will see, come winter, whose God is the stronger. The next few months were clouded with shadows of war between the church and the Green Man followers. The Reverend Lundgren, a figure Jeff had read about in town history, preached venom against the pagans and their earth religions. He called them profane, the foolish ideas of uneducated man, and by autumn, only 6 of the town elders were still among the Green Man's fold. All of them had lost a member of their family to the flock, as they preached of love and life everlasting, a much more hopeful message than the bleak teachings of the Green Man followers. The writer's words became barbed and filled with threats the farther Jeff read, and the cold wasn't the only thing that made him shiver. August 1st. As I smelled the air this morning, I could feel his power rising. Every leaf upon the tree says burn me in his honor. Every plant in the field hopes to be laid upon his table this Thanksgiving. Every drop of blood within my body cries out to be used by him, and I am powerless to disobey. The 5 of us, Moore, Rita, Critch, Norwell, and myself, have met to discuss what must be done. Clades, Dykes, North, Gobbler, and Jockaroo have betrayed us, and it is from their homes we shall draw our sacrifice this year. Willing or not, pure or not, we will have our vengeance upon those who have wronged us. Reeder and Moore have returned to their homesteads, and though Norwell abides in the town, he has moved his family back to his farm so that more of them may escape the taint of Lundgren. There is war coming, a war of faith, and I pray that we are all resolved to it. September and October went by uneventfully, but when October came, there was indeed a bounty. October 4th. Gobbler has returned to our folds. He claims that his leaving was for information gathering, and we pretend not to know what we have known since the 2 of us were children in the woods. Garrus Gobbler is a weak vessel full of fear, and I feel sure that even Lundgren knows it. He does bring news, though. Lundgren fears they who worship in the woods. He thinks us pagans, Gobbler claims, or maybe Odinists. To Lundgren, though, any religion not his own smacks of hellfire, and he has lumped us in with those who worship Satan, as though my lord were not a mailed fist that men cringed to mention when that red imp was still upon the tit. I've been at thought lately about this year's sacrifice, and I believe I have the perfect one. Perhaps it's time that Lundgren was properly welcomed to the community. Car 3, do you read? Over. That was Terry Knorr. Terry and Jeff had gone to high school together, and though they hadn't run in the same circles, they were brothers in blue now. Jeff keyed up the mic and copied, and Terry asked if he could see the fire from the farmhouse. Jeff got out of the cruiser and looked towards the woods, realizing that he could see a fire. His mouth hung open as he climbed back in the cruiser to radio the fire department. If left to its own devices, that fire could burn down the whole damn forest. He had reached for the knob so he could turn it to the right frequency, when Terry asked him again if he could see it. "I see her, Terry. Do you want emergency services down there to put it out?" "Negative, it's contained. I just wanted to know if you could see it. Damn near burned my eyebrows off from a mile back. Over." Jeff laughed and told Terry that he copied before hanging up the mic. He was a little jealous of Terry, off in the woods with the sheriff while Jeff was watching the vehicles. Jeff supposed that Terry had seniority since he'd been with the force since the 2 graduated high school. Besides, Jeff thought as he picked up the book again, this was starting to get good. The old book creaked again as he opened it to the spot he'd left off on, and as Jeff read on, he realized that things were about to get worse. December 1st. North tried to come to the harvest celebration yesterday, but we turned him away. His son, Jensen North, is with us, and wouldn't even look at his father or family when they arrived. He did speak to his oldest brother before he left, and I feel we'll have a few more Norths before the year's end. I will not charge the children for the sins of the father. The Green Man draws only the loyal to him after all. North tried to warn me before he left, telling me that Lundgren knew what he was planning, and if there was to be a fight, then the priest would fight. I invited him to tell his false savior that we too would fight, but only time will tell if a fight is needed. There was some weird static on the radio, but it went dead pretty quickly. Jeff looked at it for a few minutes and then got back to his book. December 15th. We've chosen our sacrifice. Her loss will bring fear to the flock and make the old man look weak. We will take her on the 23rd. Let them look for her if they will, but her bones will belong to the Green Man. Agent Reinhold here. Does anyone copy? His voice was hushed and whispery, and Jeff made his low too as he keyed up the mic and told him to go ahead. We have a visual on the suspect and the child. We're fanning out to capture. Maintain radio silence. We will advise when we apprehend the suspect. Then the radio went dead, and Jeff clicked the double-click break so that they would know he had copied. Then he turned back to the book. The next few entries covered Jafferth and his allies as they planned the abduction. This particular Jafferth was firm in his convictions, but not so subtle as he maybe should be. It appeared that he had misstepped at some point, because the entry on the 24th contained none of his usual snarling bravado or religious sureness. His entry on the 24th sounded downright scared. December 24th. All is lost. We're surely dead. They found our altar, found us as the wind was rising, and his horse was approaching. They came from the woods with crosses raised and scriptures called aloud and proud. It all died when they saw him. When his horse walked from the woods, his antlers on full display and his axe raised, the ire was in his voice, and they ran like rabbits. We ran too, all of us separated in the storm, but I managed to bring most of mine home before they froze to death. Mama, Jesse, William, Fawn, David, and I now locked inside and huddled in the basement as the blizzard surges around us. I know not what became of Raymond or Cass, but I trust that they are safe or in his legion now. As for the other elders, I pray that they've made it away safely. As for our enemies, I pray that they taste the full brunt of his fury. The next entry was dated January 2nd, but as Jeff turned the page, the radio erupted in sounds of gunfire. Dispatch, dispatch, send help to Harder's Den. We've been ambushed, officers down, weapons hot, shots fired, repeat shots. But the radio abruptly went silent. Jeff sat in the car, his shivering having nothing to do with the cold. What had happened out there? Were they okay? Whoever had been on the radio said, officer down, which meant wounded, or dead. Jeff had started to leave the vehicle when dispatch called him over the radio. Be advised, do not leave the vehicle. Do not enter the woods alone. Wait for backup to arrive. Do you copy car 3? Jeff wanted to tell dispatch that he copied no such thing and head into the woods as fast as he could, but he knew she was right. If Jeff rushed into the woods, he wouldn't do anything but get himself killed. He sat down, little as he wanted to, and waited for the blue and white lights he knew were on the way. Jeff's eyes strayed back to the book again, but he dared not pick it up. This was no time for distractions. Jeff didn't need someone sneaking up on him while his mind was elsewhere. But as the minutes spooled out, he grew weak. Jeff felt his hand stretch out for the book, and when he opened it, he saw what came next. It appeared that there was a little more town history to be gleaned from this journal. January 1st. The blizzard has stopped. The Winter Lord, in all his anger, has finally blown himself out. Now we see what is left. Critch and Rita have come to see us, my Cass having spent the last few nights with the Reader clan. He didn't come back alone either. It seems my clan is to be joined to Reader's. Cass spent the last 8 days with Shemia Reader, and now, come spring, the two wish to be wed beneath the green boughs. The Moors came next. Choctus Moore had perished in the storm, but his brother Eustace has taken the clan and Choctus's wife as well. As for the Norwells, only the patriarch survived. In time, he may raise a new family, but only time will tell. January 2nd. We returned to town today and found the wrath of the Green Man had been for them as well. The niece of Lundgren, Charlene McNeil, is safe, but her uncle has been lost and may never be found. His flock has come about her, holding her as a sort of saint, and as we approached, she had the sense to parley. Now we work out terms of inclusion. Jeff heard something and glanced up, eyes cast back towards the woods. He expected to see a small horde of green barbarians creeping up on him, but there was nothing to see. He wondered what had drawn his attention, and only then realized what it was. The fire had gone out. It was a lot darker out there without the towering light that had graced the woods, but as Jeff stared into the white forest, he realized he could see something. The trees were swaying, bending as something got closer to the house. It was moving through the woods, bending trees as it came, and before his eyes, Jeff saw tendrils of frost creep across the glass. The snow had been falling in a sluggish pattern, but began to pick up as the frost gathered. Suddenly, something hit the side of the cruiser and rocked it on its shocks. The force smashed the side of Jeff's head into the door, and as he fought to stay conscious, he heard a blizzard roaring outside. Jeff tried to crank the car, meaning to leave despite what dispatch says, but it wouldn't start. He pushed the door, knowing better than to go out in a blizzard, but was helpless as claustrophobia crept over him. The door, however, refused to budge. As the storm raged around him, Jeff hunkered down in the cruiser and massaged the side of his head. It wasn't too bad, though the bruise would definitely hurt the next day. He wondered if this is what the Jafforth clan had felt as they hunkered in their cellar and listened to the storm rage outside. That thought brought him back to the book, and he reached for it with trembling fingers as he tried to find his place. The name Charlene McNeil made him very interested to see how it ended. Charlene McNeil was another of the town founders, someone every kid learned about in school when it came time for local history. She had helped to unite the town, been its first mayor of sorts, and helped to unite the townies with the faithful. There was a picture of her on the mural of Town Hall and a bronze statue of her outside the courthouse, but none of that was what had piqued Jeff's interest. He was curious because she also had the distinction of being his great-great-grandmother. January 5th. They have seen the might of the Winter Lord, felt the ire of the Green Man, and now they believe. We have come to an understanding that they may stay in town and worship their God as they choose, and we may own our land and worship our God in the field and farmland. We will bring our harvest into town, and they will buy our food and lay by for winter. We will allow them to stay, and they will provide us with a sacrifice on the 23rd of December. The mark shall be left upon the door of their house, as it was in times gone by, and one shall come forward to be sacrificed. Thus it is, and thus it shall always be. As the dome light flickered and the battery died, Jeff read on, though he didn't need to. It was all a matter of family history. Charlene McNeil and William Jafforth, the oldest Jafforth male, had fallen in love and courted secretly. When William's father discovered them, he cast his son out, and he went to abide in the town forever after with his God-fearing wife. He had taken her name instead, and a rivalry existed between McNeils and Jafforths forever after. It had held until the last Jafforth had seen the mark upon his door, and knew that his fellows had betrayed him and sought to punish him for his impurity. The Jafforths had begun to try to repair the damage of their past. He had been trying to reconcile with the McNeils, Jeff's family, and for this, they had been punished by those in the farmland. William Jafforth, named for Jeff's great-great-great-grandfather, had decided that he would rather see his family dead than give any of them over to the madness of his so-called neighbors. Jeff was too young to remember any of this, and none of his clan ever spoke about the Jafforths if they could help it. They were a stain upon the family tree, and Jeff's father had always told him to be careful around the families from the farmland. You'll be hated by them, for both the Jafforth side and the McNeil side. Best to keep your friends in town and leave the farmers to their crops. As Jeff lay huddled on the seat of the cruiser, his jacket drawn up around him, he heard his father's words rustle like dead leaves in his head. Jeff suddenly felt that he was very likely to die here. He didn't know what had suddenly brought the blizzard here, what had suddenly put the pieces of family history in his hands, and even why he had stayed after the gunshots. But Jeff felt as if it was all bringing about the end of his life. As the ice and snow blew around the car, something that suddenly didn't feel so secure, Jeff shook his head and kept himself awake. You would have to have said that would be impossible, but Jeff began to feel very sleepy as the cold settled around him. Jeff felt sure that this would be the end as he slipped off. As he lay shivering, he wondered if he'd see Hedda when he got where he was going. The thought did nothing to warm him, and it occurred to him that it was the first time he had thought about his sister in years. Hedda had disappeared in the woods around Christmas time, too. Jeff slid off into a dream of his younger sister, the one who had disappeared when he was 12 and she was 10. She was always 10 years old in his dreams, her corn silk hair flying freely around her face as she tried to keep up with her older brother and his friends. Hedda had been spirited, a trait the women of their family often shared. She was utterly fearless, not prone to the squealing many girls found when they were presented with snakes or frogs. In his dreams, he saw her standing in the yard of this very house, looking at the same window that he had seen the shape in earlier tonight. It was the last time he had seen her, and the image was frozen in his mind forever. Jeff had always been too scared to go into 56 West Tree when he was a kid. He had been afraid that his great-great-great-grandfather's ghost would find him and punish him for the sins of his family. His friends, boys who may or may not have known his lineage, always teased him for being a scaredy cat, but no amount of teasing could ever get Jeff to go into that house. Just standing outside that house, Jeff could almost feel how much it hated him. He would no more have gone into 56 West Tree than he would have cut off his own thumb. However, there was one person who always said they would go inside. They had done it many times. None of the boys would dare say a thing to her. She was one of them. She could do and say anything that they could do 1,000 times over. Hedda, who had disappeared into that house when she was 10, was just as tough as any of the boys. Jeff remembered how they had all been daring each other to go in, telling each other they were cowards if they didn't. After all, Jeff's little sister would go in there, so why wouldn't he? Jeff and his friends had been murmuring, booing each other up to go in, and when Hedda had spoken up, all four had jumped a foot. "You big babies, let me show you it's not so scary." She had looked up at the window before going in, just like she had always done in his dream. When she had gone missing in that house, the whole town had turned up to search the woods for her. Well, the townies had at least. Most people thought she was just playing anyway. Hedda, who felt more at home in the Jafforth house than she ever did in the brick two-story they'd grown up in. Jeff jerked awake as the door was wrenched open and was blinded by the snow that blew into his face. He reached for his gun, unsure who or what had opened the door, but it was none other than Terry Knorr. Terry was a mess, but he still smiled at him as Jeff took him in with disbelief. Terry looked like he'd fallen into the swimming hole. His hair and face were muddy, and his uniform was smeared with mud, or maybe blood. Despite this, Terry seemed in fine spirit. He shook his head, dousing his smile down to a line on his mouth, and clicked his tongue at Jeff. "Now, I'm not sure if I should keep such a man on my force, I tell you what." Jeff let a smile stretch across his face as he wrapped the man in a bear hug. Friend or not, it was nice to be reminded that there were still people out there. "Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes? Your force, huh? Better not let Sheriff hear you talking like that." Terry's face became serious, his glee melting like the snow. "Critch is dead, McNeil. He caught a bullet from one of the state boys and went down hard. If it hadn't been for her, I don't think any of us would have gotten out alive." He nodded behind him, and out of the shadows stepped a tall, robed figure with a mop of blonde hair and a half-crazed smile that seemed likely to split her face in two. Jeff had already gotten out of the car when the woman scooped him into a hug. Jeff went rigid, feeling like a rabbit that's been caught by a hawk. She held a definite aroma of woods about her, and when she released him, she brought her face very close to his. Jeff stared into those half-crazed eyes and was surprised to discover that he knew her. Hadn't he just been thinking of Hedda? Hedda smiled at him. "Happy Yule, brother. I've been out about his work, and I'm back now. And we have much to catch up on." A small group of grubby officers came staggering out of the woods behind her, Agent Reinfield hanging limply between the two of them. He was bloody, but seemed to be breathing. Jeff could see half his face was burned, a long, angry swatch of skin, and the men holding him seemed as elated as Hedda. Jeff looked back to his sister, her pale hands holding a long, cruel knife, as she held it out for him to take. "It's time for you to do your part, Jeffrey. It's time for the Green Man to have his sacrifice." Reinhold lifted his head a little, begging Jeff for help, but Jeff hardly felt he had any choice. He could hardly take 4 full-grown men or his feral-looking sister on his own, and with each step, Jeff felt sure that this was the right thing to do. Reinhold struggled, but he had come to the same conclusion as Jeff had. After all, Jeff thought, as he slid the knife across the agent's throat and let his blood patter onto the snow, it was in his blood, wasn't it? Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story and you haven't already, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. While you're here, maybe go ahead and give that video a like and drop a comment. I like it when people comment. If you're not too spooked and you think you might can handle a little more, why not go ahead and click on one of those other videos that's about to pop up? Maybe check out one of our playlists. There's quite a few. If you'd like to support the channel more monetarily, I'd suggest maybe you go pick up a copy of my latest book. There's a link below. Or maybe head on over to Patreon. I have quite a few tiers. I'm sure there's one that'll suit you best. Speaking of Patreon, let's go ahead and thank our patrons, shall we? Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. And thanks to Winters, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're a fan of my books, I always recommend go ahead and join that Ghostly Reader tier. $10 a month, and it also gets you a book anytime I write one, which is around twice a year usually. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.